But this was like the worst 100 days by many people's standards of the last century. More than 1 million people killed by largely their neighbors. But that's not all we're talking to the students about. They've been studying this, and it's usually teachers. There was a documentary that came out in 2004, which got us started on PBS Frontline, and it was called Ghost of Rwanda, and it was about the Rwandan genocide. And my wife and I were there in Rwanda. We moved there in 1990, working with ADRA. So that's the story I'll dig into a little deeper in church time today. But I just wanted to give you a little background of where I'm coming from and what's going on. And I have my Bible right here. It does feel funny to be standing here in church without my physical Bible, but I'm traveling all the time, and so this is my whole library here. I can't tell you how many books I have in that. And so we'll look at during church time, we'll look at the story a little more in depth. But I wanted to just highlight 2 stories with you this morning and explore with you some of the lessons from those stories. I'm already warming up. I hope it's okay if I de-jacket. Oh boy. Should have done that before you wired me up, huh, kind sir? I'll come back to you so I don't mess things up too much. You know, here we go. Whether I'm coming to a high school or to a church, we're all kind of human, and it's really easy when somebody comes in. We start, okay, I'll just be blunt. We start assessing them right from the get-go. From the smile, from the clothing, from the hair, from the age, from the gender, all of those different things. So I do my best when I go to different places not to let any of that get in the way. And so honestly, I haven't had a suit and tie on for a while. But I told my wife my wife and daughter are in Portland this morning. I'm telling stories on them that they're not here with me right now, but we'll meet up afterwards. But I have these wonderful memories of my dad, who worked for the church for all of his career, coming home with usually a white shirt and a tie at the end of a business day, and just warm memories of those things. It's just interesting how our clothing and our mind works, and so let's get back to where we were here. And we will talk more about this idea of genocide. I actually, 18 years ago, when I started traveling to schools, I was like, how can I begin to explain something as horrible as genocide? 7th graders, high schoolers. Our world has changed a lot in the last 18 years. But I haven't changed this definition. It's not even a technical definition, but it's a way to enter into the conversation. Because people say, why would you travel around speaking about genocide? What a horrible topic. And I think as we look at this, well, for one thing, I have those kind of pathways in my head. Not that I want to kill or hurt anybody, but it's often easy to think about, if I just didn't have to deal with this person, We're going to solve a problem by kind of excluding. And that kind of excluding, that kind of problem solving, genocide, temporary at best, genocide at worst. So we'll get into that and its foundational root with a blame mindset some more at church. Small group of men and women who planned the genocide, and as I just put this slide up for you earlier, our family at the time in 1994, after we'd been in the country for 4 years already working with ADRA, my mom and dad were visiting. Interesting little fact, I'm actually 2 years older than my dad was in that picture. This picture was probably taken about a week or two before the genocide started. And so we'll dive into that a little later, the people I was living and working with during that time, some of the stories. But where I wanted to just go with you this morning is my friend Gasikwa. Gasikwa had worked with me in ADRA for 4 years already. He had been working in ADRA probably for more than 12 years. First came as a custodian, then the ADRA director's wife, Ruby Stafford. Some of you might know the Staffords here around the Northwest. Ruby said to Gasikwa one morning, "Gasikwa, is there something else you'd like to do in addition to being a custodian?" She encouraged him to get his driver's license, and the story just goes on. I made him a project manager when I was there. The faithfulness of this man was just incredible. His honesty. In fact, I came home for a furlough one year. Better just quit messing with that. Came home for a furlough, and I brought him back a radio cassette player. He really, just really, you know, the choir music and those things, and it's fun with a group like you. I don't have to explain what a radio cassette player is. And we're in my office there at ADRA, and I said, "Gasikwa, come in the office a minute. I've got something for you." So he comes in. We're speaking in French. That was the other language in Rwanda. And I wish I would have learned Kinyarwanda, the local language. But we're speaking in French, and I said, "I've got something for you." And I bring out this radio cassette player, and I give it to him, and he's like, "Oh, merci beaucoup, you know, thank you so much. How much is it?" And I go, "No, Gasikwa, it's a gift." "Ah, merci, merci, thank you so much. But how much is it?" And I'm like, "Okay, wait, c'est un don, it's a gift." I'm trying to think what other word, how can I say it more clearly in French, you know, and I keep trying to get through to him, "It's a gift." And he's like, "Yes, yes, thank you, I understand, but how much?" And finally he said the word dîme, which in French is tithe. He wanted to know how much it was so he could give a tithe on it. You talk about faithfulness in little things, and then this horrible thing called genocide explodes, and people start coming to his home. Now, we'll talk a little later about the privilege that we foreigners enjoyed and why my wife and I made the decision that I would stay. Well, Gasikwa didn't have that privilege as a foreigner. Gasikwa didn't have guns. The local government guy in his neighborhood, I call him mini mayor, in French they called him the counselor. The local counselor was in a similar situation to Gasikwa. Gasikwa was part of the majority group in this country, and some of you who are familiar with the story, I'm sure you've heard about the majority Hutu and the minority Tutsi, and often the story is painted like one group hated the other group, and finally you have genocide. And there's just nothing spontaneous about genocide. It doesn't just happen. In fact, I'd put forth to you that it's hard to pull off a genocide among people who are made in the image of God. And so in this country, the majority and the minority spoke the same language. Went to some Catholic, some Protestant, some traditional religions and stuff, did business together, sang in the choir together, fell in love and got married. So this is not a story of one group hating another group. This is a story of a small group of basically politicians, businessmen and women, constructing a story, and in that story we have somebody to blame. And then in that blame mindset, we begin to move people to a different part of their brain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So Gasikwa was part of the majority. He was married to a lady, part of the minority. The counselor in his neighborhood, similar situation. Majority, minority. An extremist among the majority had this message: our country would be better. These people, the Tutsi, the minority, they're the whole problem. We got to get rid of all of them. They will go even to the extreme of going in the courthouses and finding birth certificates, marriage certificates, property deeds. We're not just killing them, destroying their homes. We're trying to destroy any evidence, like what would you call opposite of archaeologists who are looking for evidence of a civilization? They're working at destroying any evidence of a civilization. It just kind of gives me chills even as I say that to you right now. How in the world can somebody get to that place? And how in the world, in a country of 7 million, where probably at least 6 million and probably 6 point something million are in church every weekend? How do you carry out an extermination campaign like that? Rwanda, by the way, the first largest religion, Catholic, second largest Seventh-day Adventist. Rwanda is now over 1 million Seventh-day Adventists in a tiny little country of 12 million. Basically 1 in 12. massive Adventist population. Back then, it was in a country of 7 million, they were about 300,000, like a digit on your finger. We still in the North Pacific Union, are we even up to 100,000 members yet? Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Alaska. You could take Rwanda. I kind of forget where I am sometimes speaking. I'm from Spokane. So you could go from Canada to Spokane to Grand Coulee to Canada. That little corner of Washington State, that would be Rwanda. So in that tiny little space, most densely populated country in Africa, you've got this massive population of Christians. So the local counselor comes to Gasikwa because the government has been taken over by the extremists. And the new message is, we have to protect ourselves. If you don't kill them, they'll kill you. And there's a lot more layers to the story. But this man comes to Gasikwa and says, Gasikwa, can you take my wife and children? I'm afraid I can't protect them. Now, he has some clout as a government worker, but here's the deal. Is he going to be loyal to the new government, who identifies this group as the enemy and we're exterminating this group? Or is he going to be loyal to created in the image of God? And what does that mean, created in the image of God? He'll end up with more than 40 people in his home. And about half of them, he told us, were children. And one day, I said that we're going to get into some of this story at church. I won't go deep in some of it. There's about a 40-minute film that we send to schools. Who was I just talking about? I do Zooms too. And so these schools, like the high schools I was visiting in Buffalo and stuff, they'll watch this 40-minute film and see the story of the genocide through the lens of our family. So we get the basic foundation down of what happened, the decision to stay, the kind of work I was doing with people like Gasikwa during the genocide, bringing food and water and medicine to groups of orphans. So I'll touch on that story a bit more, but I'm not going to go very deep because you can, 40 minutes, and if you're interested on YouTube, you'll be able to go a lot deeper than I could with you this morning. But in this short little, and so the reason I went off on that, this is a screenshot from that film. That 40-minute film has, let me just pop it up here so that I don't, no, it's not on this set of pictures, so we'll grab it later. I'll put it up in church. But in that film, telling the story, we highlight Gasikwa and the neighbors coming one day to kill the people in his house. Remember, yeah, thank you so much, merci beaucoup, but how much, The man who pays a tithe on the radio cassette gift. You see, he doesn't have the privilege of a foreigner and he doesn't have guns, but he has integrity. And that integrity filled his house with women and children during this killing time. And his neighbors come to kill him. I mean, they don't want their family to be killed. And this is not so simple as saying, well, kill or you'll get killed. I mean, you can understand that at one level. But it's so much more complex. Gasikwa actually said when the guys were at the gate, a little fence around his house and stuff, they were hesitating. I would say they were hesitating because every time we're involved in something that is inhuman, there's a conflict going on. And I speak openly to you about that conflict of we're made in the image of God. So this idea of being made in the image of God, you're told to do something inhuman, you got a conflict going on. And so Gasikwa, from the get-go, he actually calls out before they even come in through the gate. I don't know the neighbors' names. I've just kind of named the guy on the left Bernard. I could probably ask Gasikwa, but we've had certain conversations. Yeah, you ask me about him later, I'll tell you more. But he shot Bernard. Your daughters must be hungry. Hey, this is hard times we're living in. Would you like some chickens? And imagine the night before, Bernard putting his little girls to bed, and Dad, I can't sleep, I'm hungry. Well, come on, babe, here, have a little drink. I don't want a drink, I want food. Tomorrow I'm going to find you some food. If you can just get to... No idea that the next day he would find food at the generosity of a man who he's planning to kill and the people in his house. This just is so counterintuitive to so much of the way we think and so much of the way we respond. And I often try to figure out how can you explain, how somebody can go from from a kind, generous person to a murderer? How does that happen? And then can they, you can't, let's go this direction. Kind, generous to murderer, life doesn't go back. Can they ever be trusted again? And you know, isn't it interesting that when we talk about can people change, we're almost always talking about changing in a positive direction. Nobody asks a question, can people change in a negative? Anybody challenge that idea? No, we've all seen it with our own eyes. And in Rwanda's case, we saw the bodies. But then the question comes, can we change in a positive direction? And so this whole idea of how people could do this is just a constant challenge to me. And I'm always looking for ways to understand and ways to try to generate a meaningful conversation with students. So here is one of my most recent frameworks. We're all pretty familiar with the idea of fight-flight. Down here in the brainstem, they actually say the amygdala, right? Okay? No question that these guys who have come here, well, okay, let's start here. The kind, generous person, how do we get them? How do we control people? Fear. Once we're down in the fight-flight part of our brain, oh my goodness, so much easier to manipulate. We just don't have access to the good place, that frontal lobe, the cerebral cortex, this area made in the image of God. Now the fight-flight is important. God knew when God created us, you know, that this brain, you know, who's going to be able to create a creature that's going to live through all of the changes that humanity and civilization has lived through and still be a functioning, viable, and hopefully loving, caring salt of the earth, you know, light to the kingdom and stuff like that. So I started putting this framework together and saying, okay, the people who came to Gasikwa's house, you know, definitely those guys are in the fight-flight. But the brain people also tell us that there's all kinds of competition that goes on between this amygdala area, this fight-flight area, and the frontal lobe. I hear an explosion, and the amygdala is like, run for your life! And the frontal lobe says, no, you're in a thunderstorm. That was thunder. Oh, and the amygdala settles down, and I go on about it. You know, there's this constant conversation that goes on. But the more we live in a fight-flight atmosphere, frame of mind, the weaker the connections between the amygdala and the frontal lobe. The harder it is to function in a healthy manner. So it seems to me that when these guys come to Gasikwa's home, if I'm Gasikwa, I'm going to be like, boom, in the amygdala, fight, flight. What's wrong with you guys? Hey, we're neighbors. These are women and children. What? You see that attitude? Or, Bernard, your daughters must be hungry. You see, there's things that I can say that can move me from the good place down to the fight-flight mode. Or there's things too that I can say to move myself. It's so much easier to focus on other people. Oh, this guy's in the fight-flight mode, you know, and oh my goodness, he's hopeless. Can't get through, all of these kind of things. Whereas Gasikwa, through kindness, it's like he reaches down in there. I know this is kind of ridiculous, but it makes sense to me. It's like he reaches into their amygdala, pushes a kind of pause button there. They actually have a phrase in science that's called hijack, amygdala hijack. And that makes sense, huh? The amygdala just takes over in the brain there. So through kindness, Gasikwa makes it possible for these men to get back into the frontal lobe. Are you kidding me? And they said, how many chickens? And he goes, well, how many do you need? This idea of empathy first, my goodness, you guys, this is my greatest desire right now in my marriage, in my community, in my self-talk. If I can respond with empathy first, instead of the fight-flight, response to things. You come into a situation and somebody says, oh no, I had the joy of a wedding last weekend. And the bride, she wanted my wife to play. She was a Milo kid years ago, and she loved my wife's music. My wife's an incredible pianist and stuff. And so as I came, I had talked to her about, and it was in a riding arena, so not in a church, no piano or anything for this wedding. And so I come into the wedding with the keyboard under my arm, and the wedding planner, I forgot to say anything to her. I'd talked to the bride. I thought this, she's like, oh, whoa, what what are you going to do with that? And I don't know that we can hook it in our PA system and everything. My first response wasn't, this lady's under a lot of pressure today. She really wants things to go well for the bride and groom. My first response was, no, we can make this work. You understand that? Now, if I would have responded with empathy first and said, Victoria, I should have said something to you about this yesterday at rehearsal. I don't know what I was thinking. Today is a day of a lot of tension, and you don't need more tension, do you? Huh? Could have very well helped her move from that fight-flight part back up to the good place. Just a simple little illustration like that. So in this idea of empathy first, and I used to just use this with the students, empathy is all about our shared humanity. It's about, sorry, that's a little washed out. The white one says story too. So it's about you and me sharing our stories together, seeing how they interact and stuff. Do you have any brothers or sisters? How many? When you were little kids, where'd you grow up? Six of you.
Yeah.
And what number were you among the six?
Number 2.
Number 2, yeah. Now, I can pretty much promise every single one of you said in your head how many kids in your family and what position you are. We just can't help it. When we hear a story, we just, made in the image of God, we're wired for community. We're wired for empathy. And I threw in the little equal mark there because we can learn each other's stories, but if we think we are superior to somebody else, then we won't necessarily reach empathy. It'll be more likely sympathy. And sympathy doesn't usually connect us anywhere near the way that empathy connects us. But then I was like, okay, there's got to be another way, and to kind of explain empathy. So about 2 months ago, I came up with these glasses, and these are my empathy glasses, okay? I think that there's 2 things that I've picked to really develop, we're going to talk about neural pathways in just a moment, but to really develop empathy in my life, and for this goal of empathy first, my big problem is judgment and exclusion. As soon as I hear something, I'm quick to judge. And I grew up, you're rewarded for being quick to judge. Sum up the situation, make a decision and stuff, and that's what we're rewarded for. Curiosity, not always rewarded. But I believe that made in the image of God, curiosity, not judgment. Amen. And so looking at these glasses, that curiosity can lead me to connection. Driving on Interstate 90 the other day, Spokane where I live, a guy, I wasn't going fast enough for the guy behind. I was in the left-hand lane and there was a semi up ahead, so I just stayed in the left-hand lane. Guy whips around me on my right, cuts in front, nearly takes off my bumper. I mean, it was really a close one. My first response wasn't empathy first. My first response wasn't curiosity. My first response is, that guy's going to get us killed, And okay, I might have thought jerk, sorry. But that was my first response in that moment of stress. Not excusing it, because I'm the one responsible for developing the pathways in my brain, okay? But fortunately, because I am really talking and working and, journaling to God about this and everything else, it came not very long after that, wait a minute, maybe that guy's on his way to the hospital. In fact, just a couple miles up is the exit to the hospital. Curiosity. And then when I said, what if that guy's on his way to the hospital? Got news that somebody was in an accident, family and stuff. Boy, connection began. I've been in hospitals. I know what that is. Curiosity whereas connection is my best guard against exclusion. Get that guy off the highway. That's the only way we're going to solve this. Get rid of all the bad drivers. Seriously? Huh? So this idea of changing the way I look at situations and people and things like that, or we call it reframing, huh? When you change the way you look at something or somebody, and then you experience them differently. Okay? Gasikwa, he already, I look at those guys, I see killers, he sees neighbors. I see the enemy, he sees fathers. So my ability to remain curious and work towards connection directly related to my ability to reframe a situation, a person, then experience it differently. Now, all of this stuff to me makes a lot of sense, but there's still the question, how? How do you do that? And this is one of the things that got me really excited. I was listening to a podcast probably 5 years ago, The Neuroscience of Happiness. Now, for those of you who just came in, as I unpack the stories of Rwanda that we experienced with students basically around the world, I think we've been in over 20 countries. We've had so many opportunities, from China to next fall I'll be in Doha, Qatar again for the third time over there. So as I'm telling these stories of Rwanda, and I'm really sharing, I'm able to just talk openly with you this morning, made in the image of God. I don't say that openly in my presentations at the high school, but I do talk about God openly, primarily in response to their questions. See, for so many people, God is a buzzword, a barrier word. It's a trigger word. Because of all the misconceptions, it just blows me away why God lets us misrepresent them. Okay, I slipped here. When I journal, I started out writing to God, 1998. Some of you will remember maybe Net 98, Dwight Nelson. And one evening, Dwight came out with this massive stack of notebooks on this stage, and they were his prayer journals, and we were all curious. And what I remember from that was Dwight talked about writing scripture, I believe, with a red pen, and then his letter to God with a blue pen. What does this scripture say to me and my life? So that's how I started journaling. Was that only I was doing it on my laptop. I hate my handwriting, which is another issue. But anyway, and so in that process, I started writing to the Father back 98. That's 24 years ago. And maybe over the last 3 years, I said, I really don't want to trigger or get bogged down too much with ideas of how we address the Trinity and stuff. So I'm just to tell you my experience. In fact, I meant to say this at the beginning. I'm doing my best here today to be, when I'm at high schools and I'm at colleges and different places, I tell them, I'm doing my best to be descriptive. I'm not here to tell you what you should do. I'm not trying to give any prescription. God gave us all the power of choice. God created us. God wants us to choose. That's one of the highest things God gave us. So I don't want to prescribe anything. When I talk about journaling for 24 years, I'm not saying you should journal, okay? And the same thing, when I'm just about to tell you, I now write to the Father, the Spirit, and Jesus. I address all three of them. And so what I was just about to say to you was, I don't know why God doesn't. When I think God, I think all three. And so why God, I was about to say to you, I don't know why God lets us misrepresent them. And I felt like I needed to explain that, because for so much of my life I say Him. But I feel like in my terminology, my journey, I am limiting myself. I am working on building pathways in my brain of an awareness of all three, the Father, the Spirit, and the Son. And I'm like, okay, well, how do I talk to the Holy Spirit? Well, yeah, fill me, Holy Spirit, but I want this to become more real and more natural. And as I talk to Jesus when I'm journaling, and the Father, and so please, I'm not being prescriptive to anybody, but this is, so my point back up here was, why does God let us give such twisted pictures, representations? But God, this idea of choice is so big, because I believe God wants a love that is only from choice, not from fear, not from coercion, not from manipulation, not from guilt, not from shame. A love that is driven, that is drawn from beauty and grace and kindness. And it's your kindness that draws me to you. It's not, I know I'm going to run out of time when we're doing this, so I'm going to just skip right ahead. No, in church, I got another set of pictures for that. So, Gasikwa, God. Oh yeah, I was just saying that when I'm there, students often will ask me, you were there with the Adventists, you were there as a missionary, right? And I'll go, yeah. So what about God? How can you go through a genocide and still believe in God? And I'm like, I'm so glad you asked, because I've been asking myself a lot about that too. Try to figure out, because a lot of people, they say, well, look, all loving, all powerful, genocide? I mean, I'm nowhere near anything like a God, good, kind person. And if I had power and I was all loving, I sure wouldn't just sit by and watch grandmas and little ones and tortured and raped and killed and stuff. And so I understand that question and that argument, or that frame of mind that has driven so many people away from God. So typically I don't use the word God until they ask me. When I'm referring to God, most times I talk about good. It's just that extra O in there, from God to good. And of course we're all like, yeah, God is love, God is good. Back to my last, I had two stories I wanted to give with you this morning, but this one, okay, yeah. So this was the other really helpful tool that I came on. And again, actually, I'll pause after this, after I explain this in a minute, because I want to hear some thoughts from you. This whole idea, remember, of we don't question, people can change from kind and generous to harmful, to murderers. The real challenge is believing if people can ever be trusted again. Can they be, well, in Christian circles we might say born again. What's born again got to do with neuroplasticity? Because for years they thought we couldn't make new pathways in our brain. And it was only like 20 years ago that they began to say, oh yes, we can. There's some amazing stories of people who, well, my dad had a brain bleed in his early 70s, stroke, mostly one side, not serious, fortunately. And so after a couple of months, never affected his speech after the initial, 48 hours or so of the stroke. But then he came back full function. Still, when he stood in the shower, one side of his back felt a little different than the other. That's the only thing he could feel. Later on, Dad passed away last summer at 89. I think at about 87, there were some things checking on. He had some dizziness and stuff, and they did a scan. And the neurologist said to my brother, who's a family doc in Spokane, my older brother, he said, Keith, your dad, I don't know how he's doing as well as he does. His brain looks like Swiss cheese. And you're like, what? Dad was this lifelong learner right up to the end. One of the last books he was reading was on social emotional intelligence. And sometimes he'd lay it down and do the audio version because his eyes would get tired. But this lifelong learner, you had no idea from the outside, from conversations, from function, memories of, working for the church for years and stuff. It was so touching. Before he had 18 days from a blood clot in his leg, and then his lung, and then systems. He had 18 days we were riding bikes on Wednesday, he and I. He wasn't so steady on his feet at 89, but he had a recumbent with electric assist. So, and it doesn't help you unless you're pedaling. And when he was sitting in that thing, he felt like a kid again. He was stable, and you feel like Superman when you have electric assist, huh? And so we were doing that 3 weeks before he died. But right there in the last days, he wanted to see the pastor, and the pastor was new in our church, and I was kind of interested that Dad really wanted to see the pastor because he was a new guy, but anyway, we invited, and the pastor came, and as they had that last conversation, this is days before he dies, there was this sense of camaraderie of a fellow worker in the vineyard, in the field. And I think about, I just kind of sat on the side and listened to that conversation, and I was just like, made in the image of God. And when we are, Jesus says, you're blessed when you learn how to care for others. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. You're like, serious? Yeah, because there's less of you and more of God. These are all things that are pathways in our brain. Just as much as 8 times 8 is 64 is a pathway in our brain. And we learn the directions. We've got 2 new grandsons. I learned a lot. The second one came 4.5 weeks early. There they are. The second one came 4.5 weeks early. I got to spend 24/7 with his older brother. They're just 15 months apart. I learned a lot about neonatal care. He was in NICU for about 10 days. His lungs needed more help. We're constantly learning. We're constantly building new pathways in our brain. And so this idea of that we can build we can rewire our brain, we can fire pathways in our brain that will change the way we think. When we change the way we think, it changes the way we feel. And when we change the way we feel, it changes the way we act. And so this ability, when I look at somebody who was involved in the genocide, I've had several encounters with people. Years later, this one guy that I met, we'll see if we get time here this morning to talk about him. I won't pull up his picture. He and his gang were responsible for more than 2,000 people. And when I met him, I was angrier. In 2015, 21 years after the genocide, I was angrier than any other time I could imagine in my life. And I had no idea I had that much anger inside of me. And our ability to rewire, are the choices we make to rewire. People always tell you choices are important, huh? Or people always say, to count to 10 to calm down. But why? What's going on in my brain during that time? What did God foresee and foreplan in creating my brain in a way that can navigate even through, years and years and years and decades, thousands of years of sin? How can I still function in a way that reflects the image of God? So one of my examples for neuroplasticity that's just, to me, really super down to earth and very practical is, in dealing with what I went through during the genocide and stuff, eventually I remember sitting down at the computer one day and looking at PTSD and just checking the boxes and going, oh my goodness, this explains so much. I've been really critical towards my wife. In fact, there were some times too when I was not, I was working at Milo. I was the chaplain. First career shop teacher, auto mechanics, welding. That's what I did at Walla Walla. Secondary certification, teaching shop. Then development work with ADRA and stuff. And then I had this wonderful opportunity. Some of you will remember Alf Birch. He was the president of Oregon Conference. And Alf is the one who invited me to Milo. And I'm like, are you kidding me, Alf? I don't have theology. I didn't go through religion or anything. He says, yeah, but we just want somebody to teach our kids about Jesus. And so I said, well, and I had a ball at Milo for those 11 years. But during that time, the chaplain, you're supposed to have it together. People think what. Man, some mornings I just wasn't ready to face anybody. Our house was across the river. Some of you know Milo and the Umpqua River house. The parsonage was on the other side of the river. Teresa, will you take the kids to school because I'm just not ready yet? And I would go walking with my dogs. And some of you who know Milo, thousands of acres of BLM forest. It's just gorgeous. And I would end up slumping down against one of those big, beautiful trees and just sobbing. Sobbing like a little kid, hey? You know how you're not sure you're going to breathe again when you're sobbing that much? I don't know. I hope you haven't had that at least much as an adult, although it's an interesting process for us to go through. You finally, the dogs are licking the tears off my face, and I don't usually let dogs lick my face, but I try not to judge people who do. I don't want to judge. I want to be curious, right? But this time, the dogs licked the tears. Unconditional love. Oh my goodness. God and dogs and unconditional love. Finally get all cried out. Go back to the house, take a shower, get dressed, put on a face, and go to work. But inside, I was just a mess. The Iraq War had started there. It's around 2003. Man, I'm seeing images from that. I finally went and saw a counselor. I talked to the pastor there in Roseburg, Scott Lamert. I said, Scott, do you know anybody I can go talk to? I need to talk to somebody. And he recommended a wonderful guy. And I've had a couple of counselors since then that have just given me tools, given me vocabulary, given me a safe place to explore stuff. You know there's a difference between remembering and reliving? You see, as I would tell these stories from Rwanda and the genocide, for years I would get knots in my stomach. But I'm like, you got to do this. But something doesn't seem right. Am I re-traumatizing myself as I relive this? Hormones released in my body, the whole package snatched back to 1994? And is there a way to honestly tell these stories from your heart, vulnerable with people? No problem with tears. Tears are part of way we're wired. That didn't worry me. It was the knot in my stomach. What was my body telling me as I was recounting these traumatic stories? And then I started to learn about the difference between remembering and reliving. And so this whole journey, coming back to the idea of neural pathways, I said I was feeling critical towards my wife and stuff. Well, one of the things I started doing was every morning in my journaling, I started writing one thing positive about my wife that I really appreciated from the day before. Radically changing my perception, reframing. In fact, it was so good for our marriage that I thought, we got 3 teenage kids. Why don't I do that with my kids every morning in my journaling? And here's the embarrassing part. The first morning I had that idea, I couldn't think of one thing from the day before. And they're not bad, they're good kids, but it's like, homework or your room or whatever parents kind of do. And I'm like, are you kidding me, God? I can't write one positive thing from my kids the day before? That will not happen tomorrow. Today, I will go through the day and I will find stuff to write in my journal tomorrow for each one of them. That intentionality, the brain people tell us negative stuff sticks like Velcro. You don't have to work on that. It sticks. Positive stuff slides off like Teflon. That you've got to spend time with, looking for the good. Or in our case, here in a Christian community this morning, for God. Looking for God in everything around me. So then I'm like, oh, you know what else? Instead of just really trying not to be critical, in addition to a gratitude journal, I'm going to start practicing with something easy, food. Oh my goodness, food is so easy. I can say thank you, of course, to my wife. Thank you, Taco Bell. Thank you, grocery store. Don't leave a restaurant without pushing the door open to the kitchen. Thanks, that eggplant parmesan was just, thank you, thank you, food. I'm driving across the bridge into New York City, $15 to get there to a school in New York City. And I'm like, yeah, we're halfway across the bridge in the middle of my roaring. The thought fires in my brain, did you thank the toll taker? Are you kidding me? He's part of the system that robbed me. No, he's not. He was just doing his job. This morning at the hotel, you thanked the lady at the breakfast bar, Push that little door open. She's like, oh, thinking maybe they're out of eggs or something. No, I just wanted to say thanks for breakfast. Oh, you're welcome. Usually somebody from another country, you're welcome. Will you be back this evening? And I thought, is she going to make something special? Sorry, I'm just here for one day. And as I was driving across the bridge, I realized you could have had the same thing, the same dopamine, the same, cerebral, the same firing pathways that happened this morning with the lady at the hotel. You could have had that with the guy at the toll booth. So now I have so much fun with people at the toll booth. It's this whole reframing things, seeing it differently, building new pathways in my brain. Pretty much promise you, I never would have thought to say thank you to the toll taker if I didn't already have several years of thank you related to food. Something easy. So this idea that God has given us the ability to rewire our brain. And when Jesus came, and that's what we want to dive into in church time, Jesus came with these radical messages that say, you've heard this, but I'm telling you this. You've heard an eye for an eye, but I'm telling you, the kingdom of God seems to be so flipped upside down. I am clearly not going to get to my last story here. So, Angelique. So I'm going to give you my last story of my friend Gasikwa. Gasikwa eventually moves to America. And he's in South Bend, next door South Bend, Mishawaka. And after some years, Habitat for Humanity builds him and his family a house. Wonderful. Gift with a mortgage. Okay? Which is good because that's sustainability. Then they can build more houses for people, and it builds responsibility and everything else. So he's faithful, but he never could have gotten a mortgage. He couldn't have qualified for a loan and stuff like that. So it was a wonderful gift, and I was just so happy when I saw these people from an insurance company working all day there with their employees. I'm like, I actually wrote to the head of the insurance company. I said, do you have any idea about the story of the man whose house you were just building? And I told him a little bit about Gasikwa's story in Rwanda and the 40 people in his home that he was working to protect and things like that. Well, Gasikwa the Habitat had built a home in a kind of impoverished neighborhood. I think they were building several homes, trying to kind of lift the neighborhood a bit. And the guy behind him, an old gentleman, an old white guy, Gasikwa started noticing him every week heading down the alley. It was the main road, Gasikwa's house, an alley, and some other houses, and a railroad track. And guy would come out down the alley to the laundromat every week. Maybe about 82 at this point or so. Gasikwa can't take that. He stops him one day. Excuse me, sir, excuse me. And Gasikwa's working on his English because he, spoke French, Kinyarwanda, Swahili. He had been in Zimbabwe for some years, so I know he spoke some Ndebele, some Shona. But excuse me, and the old guy's like, what's this little black man want? He says, I see you every week going down with your laundry. I have a washing machine in my house. Why don't you just bring your laundry to my house? The old guy's like, no. And Gasikwa, not easily put off, huh? Why not? I won't charge you anything. We're neighbors. And of course, respect for the elderly, also deep neural pathways, respect for the elder. And the old guy finally says something. Gasikwa was telling me the story on the phone, and I didn't get it exactly, but it was something to the effect of Gasikwa being black. And so fires in my mind right away racism. And I'm like, Gasikwa, I'm so sorry, Just probably just leave the guy alone. Yeah, Gasikwa, leave the guy alone, huh? He tells me it gets winter. He tells me a little later, and I think I might have asked her. He told me, Joe, the old guy behind me, we had a snowstorm, and his sidewalk needed shoveling. I was shoveling his sidewalk. He came out. He was so angry, and he shouted at me, what are you doing? What are you doing? I don't have any money. I'm not going to pay you. It's what he assumed Gasikwa was all about. But that's Gasikwa. He doesn't know his story. He doesn't know. Gasikwa's like, no, I don't want any money. Your sidewalk needs to be shoveled. So I start asking him, periodically, how's it going? Summertime, Gasikwa, hey, how's it going with Joe? Oh, he says, they had put sod down around Gasikwa's house. He kept his lawn pristine. And he says, Joe's lawn was just weeds and everything. So I just went back to mow his lawn. It was just a small lawn. He came out, he shouted at me, and he said he was going to call the police. I didn't know what to do. And I'm like, well, Gasikwa, welcome to America for one thing, but would you ever give up? I'm there a couple of years ago, and I'm standing, that is actually kind of in the alley behind the picture of Gasikwa right there at the top in the alley. And I hear a creak and a door open, and it's Joe. Joe must be about 87 by now. And he's got a bike leaning against the house. Joe still rides a regular two-wheel bike at 87. Even though he's not that stable, he finds it easier, his main way to get around. And he starts leaning against the building on his bike and pushes off. And then at his destination, he finds a wall, rolls up to the wall, stops against the wall, stable foot, he comes pushing his bike towards the fence. Gasikwa, I said, is that Joe? Oh yeah, Joe! By now things have really changed because Gasikwa won't, integrity. What we believe and what we do matches. Joe, come here. I want you to meet my old boss from Africa, he says. And I'm super curious. It's my first time to meet Joe in person. Joe comes over. Joe looks at me, and he looks at Gasikwa. Then he looks back at me. And with tears forming in his blue eyes, he says, this man's a good neighbor. And I got tears in my eyes. And I'm like, yeah, I think he's the best neighbor anybody could ever have. Integrity, whether it was in the middle of a genocide or whether it's his neighbor in low-income neighborhood in Mishawaka. This man is not, how he treats people is not determined by how they treat him. He has neural pathways in his brain that I just love. And he's not perfect. He's got a kind of short fuse at times. But he's made in the image of God. And so I wanted to just share with you this morning, before we got into the stories later, just these ideas about empathy first. One of my goals where I'm heading towards in responding to situations, if I can respond with empathy. And often the way I'm trying to do that is just by listening. Just shut up and listen, you know. And then this idea of trying to stay out of judgment and curiosity, to replace judgment with curiosity, to replace exclusion with connection. I love it. One of our former kids at Milo, she's a school teacher now, and she posted something my wife told me. I'm not too much with social media, but my wife saw it, and she said, Kaylee just posted, you know when you see a kid acting up and you think he's just trying to get attention? I've started telling myself, no, he's trying to get connection. And I thought, wow, what a different way of looking at it. Reframing from exclusion. We could get so much done today if that kid wasn't here, you know. From exclusion to connection. And the last one is, this framework has just been so useful to me with the brain. And what are the things that I can say? You know, in May I was at high schools outside of Phoenix, and one of the teachers, we had a library. I think we had 6 periods that day. 80 kids come into the library, another 80 kids. I mean, just, you know, full nonstop day, and wonderful because the kids have seen the film. And then you've got that element who's right in the front asking questions and stuff. Teacher said, hey, okay, I need you students to take anything out of your earbuds out or anything like that, you know, for our speaker today. And she added, because that's kind of rude. Now, I know her intentions were all the best, but when I heard that, I could easily imagine, because of my experience as a student, I just wasn't a favorite student. Let's just put it that way. I went to 4 different high schools, but okay, no, I wasn't expelled from any. There were a few suspensions, but I was not the favorite, and I could see how rude is going to move me right down to the fight, flight. That word, who you calling rude? You know, that word was going to, and I realized everything I say and everything I do has an impact on my thinking, whether it moves me down to the amygdala, to the fight, flight section, or keeps me in the good place. Keeps me up there where kindness, creativity is all possible. And so this framework has really helped me a lot. And just like I said last weekend with the wedding planner, I wasn't empathy first. I wasn't there first, but I was there a quick second. And that idea of firing to rewire, because every time we fire that, we strengthen that one. I didn't get into the myelin sheath and stuff. So these were just a few of the tools that I wanted to share with you, that I share with students, which I believe are out of the toolbox of Christ. And we'll talk more about that in church. So before we go there, any thoughts that fired in your mind as we were looking and talking at this? Please.
Not thoughts other than, do you have a full, like you would have shared this morning, do you have a full
presentation, sort of?
On the mind?
I'm working on them. They're bits and pieces.
Okay.
And so there's a YouTube channel that I posted some of these things on. So if you look at Carl Wilkens on YouTube, you'll find a channel, and you'll find some of them. Okay. But we're working on it, trying to get it more. My problem is I keep thinking, no, I got to do it. That's not clear enough. And you keep thinking it's not good enough, you know, that kind of problem. But sometimes you just got to get it out there. But thank you.
We're very interested because we work with depression the way out.
Oh, wow.
And so
wow.
The rewiring, the myelin sheath,
that's your language.
Fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And it's just to me, you know, somebody said, it was an article in Tampa Times earlier this week. I was doing a Zoom with a reporter there, and she's like, what do you think we can really, she's doing a special issue for teachers, and she says, what do you think, you know, we really can do for our young people? And I said, you know, I think the most practical thing we can do is to help them understand how the brain works. Because if they understand how the brain works, they are empowered. Instead of saying, be nice, okay, we know being nice sounds good. Instead of saying, don't lose your temper, okay, don't say it. Instead of saying, don't provoke your little brother, we understand that as what we're not supposed to do or supposed to do. But when we can understand why, and I realize that kid who pushes my buttons is moving me down to the fight-flight part, and I don't have the full capacity that I want to have to respond to that situation. I am like being, you know, hogtied, or somehow I'm being limited. And I recognize that okay, no, I understand pushing buttons, I understand triggers, and now I understand their strategies to recenter. You know, somebody says count to 10. Well, that's good, but what's happening when I'm counting to 10? Oh, you mean when I fire the amygdala, it takes me about 18 minutes for those hormones to clear my system if things become calm, if it's just a kind of sudden charge but not a prolonged one? So for 18 minutes, I still have those hormones going through my brain and my body, triggering, you know, flow of blood, ability to carry oxygen to different parts of the muscles, all these things. I don't know. I'm sure I'm biased because I'm a nuts and bolts guy. That's why, you know, a shop teacher, auto mechanics, welding, that kind of stuff. I like to know how stuff works. But I think all of us, when we see really the potential that we have to change, it gives me hope. And I heard in your prayer this morning about our country. And, you know, my heart, kids say, because we'll talk here, we'll talk and then I'll sit down. But we'll talk here during church about how Rwanda is moving from a punitive system of justice for the people who did genocide to a restorative method of justice. And when I outlined this little graphic that I'm using to try to explain that to kids, to a leading academic expert on genocide. Greg Stanton is somebody that people quote all the time. He's outlined the 10 stages of genocide. Greg's a wonderful guy, and Greg's a Christian. And I was outlining to Greg this thing, and I sent him a little video, and Greg says, Carl, we're on the phone. Carl, do you know that's the gospel? And I said, come to think of it, Greg, I guess I do see that. That restorative mindset. So we'll dig into some of that hopefully here in church. Was there one other question or comment? Or I always say it's because I just explained it so well there's no questions, but yeah.
I've done a fair bit of reading on this, and it's interesting, the mind people tell us that the amygdala doesn't know the difference between a physical and emotional threat.
Right.
So whether it's somebody with a gun or a tiger versus an angry boss,
yeah,
our mind processes the same.
And that, well, yeah, it's an amazing thing because we think, oh, you're justified in responding that way. It was a tiger. But this wasn't a tiger. This was your boss. What's your problem? You know, just relax. You know, how often does just relax help you relax? Yeah. But a practice of finding the good, a practice of gratitude journal, so that way, one of the ways they say that we can most effectively move from the amygdala area back up to the frontal lobe is self-awareness. Mindfulness, the present, here where I am right now. That's the only place God is, in the present. And so while the secular community is saying mindfulness and awareness is a way to reestablish connection with the frontal lobe, we're like, yeah, because that's where God is. That calm, centered contentment that comes from just breathing a moment. I keep saying I'm going to sit down here. This is one of my favorite centering exercises when I'm really messed up, when I'm really triggered, when the amygdala has hijacked. And I say this out loud, or I'll type it again. Even though I know it by heart, I'll type it again. Because in saying this, it's just incredibly simple. God is always with me. But just saying that has power. It triggers things in my brain. It triggers pathways in my brain. And then saying God takes great delight in me, that was a hard one, because I had an argument in my head every time I said that, because I was so behavior oriented. So I had to put in there, he takes delight in me as a child of his. Okay, there's another picture of my grandson. You want to know about delight? I'm like, God takes delight in me, not because of what I do and don't do, but because I'm God's child. Man, that's got a centering, calming, peaceful effect on me. God's love calms my heart, often through music for me, but other ways that God's love calms. God has everything I need for together we're going to make it, even if I die. God's my shepherd, my redeemer. So, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And I hope we will get into some more conversation and question in church time. And thank you too for our tech team. And they heard earlier, if I kind of am like a hand tied behind my back if I don't have my pictures up here. And so you did the magic to help me get my pictures up there. Thank you. Shall I pray? Wonderful. Let's pray. Please stand with me if you can. Father, it's so good to be here in your house. We asked for your presence earlier, and we know that you are here. There's so many times, I've kind of lightly said fearfully and wonderfully made without pausing to really understand and recognize the depths and the beauty and the power. And what being made in your image really, really means. We want to love like you. I think that's the most important thing to me about being made in your image is to somehow reflect your love, and to love others like you love me, like you love us. Please continue to lead and guide us here as we switch from Sabbath school into our worship service. And we're trusting you to continue to provide just exactly what we need. We pray that with confidence because of Jesus. Amen.